Pine Hollow, Alabama, is the kind of small town where everyone knows each other. From the outside, it seems like the perfect place to raise a family. Peaceful streets lined with oak trees, a town square where people gather to shop, and homes that look the same as they did decades ago. But underneath the surface of Pine Hollow, there's an undercurrent of secrets and tension. Naomi Jackson, a 17-year-old black girl, has always felt like an outsider. Born and raised in this small, suffocating town, Naomi dreamed of escaping. Her family's life was far from ideal. Naomi's mother, Linda, had long struggled with alcoholism. Her once bright dreams faded into forgotten memories. Naomi's father had abandoned them when she was a child, leaving her to grow up with little more than her hopes for a better future. Naomi had no choice but to work hard to help support herself and her mother. She worked part-time at the local diner, cleaning houses on the side and doing whatever she could to save up for college. Though her grades in school were excellent, Naomi couldn't navigate the complexities of scholarships or college applications on her own. She lacked guidance and support, but she clung to her dream of leaving Pine Hollow and making something of herself. Unfortunately, as much as she worked, the weight of the town's racism and indifference slowly wore her down. It was the year 2010, and Naomi felt trapped in a life she didn't choose. She didn't have close friends, few in Pine Hollow dared to speak to her, and most of them treated her with a quiet disregard. Naomi spent many nights alone, staring out her bedroom window at the world she could never seem to reach. The town's racial dynamics were something she couldn't escape. She was a black girl in a town that wasn't used to seeing people like her as anything more than a second-class citizen. Sheriff James Barnes had been a fixture in Pine Hollow for more than a decade. At 45, Barnes was a tall, imposing figure, his heavy-set frame and graying hair giving him an air of authority. To the residents of Pine Hollow, Barnes was the embodiment of law and order. He ruled the town with an iron fist, and his word was gospel. He had always been seen as the protector of the town, and no one questioned his authority. What most people didn't know, however, was that Sheriff Barnes's reputation was built on more than just his role as a lawman. In the shadows of his power, whispers of his mistreatment of women had circulated for years. Young women had come and gone from the town, some of them leaving with bruises that were never explained, others vanishing entirely. People said nothing, and no one dared to confront Barnes about his behavior. After all, he was the sheriff, the man who kept Pine Hollow safe. Who would believe a girl over a man like him? Barnes had always been careful, always in control. His temper was infamous, but he rarely showed it publicly. He was calculated, methodical in how he exerted his influence over the town. He kept people in line by instilling fear in them. And as the years went on, Barnes became more brazen with his actions, his sense of power only growing as he bent the law to suit his needs. It was a hot summer evening in 2010 when Sheriff Barnes first noticed Naomi. She was walking home from her shift at the diner, her uniform clinging to her from the heat. As she walked down Main Street, she crossed paths with the sheriff, who was sitting on the steps of the sheriff's office, as he often did, keeping an eye on the town. Barnes had seen Naomi before. He knew who she was, though they had never spoken. There was something about her quiet strength, the way she carried herself, despite the hardships she faced, that caught his attention. As she walked past, Barnes greeted her casually, asking if she needed help with anything. Naomi, startled at first, smiled politely and thanked him. It seemed harmless, but there was an unsettling undertone to the way he looked at her. The next few weeks were filled with similar encounters. Barnes would stop by the diner when Naomi was working, always making small talk and complimenting her on how hard she worked. Naomi felt uncomfortable, but she didn't know why. It was just the sheriff being friendly, right? But as the days went on, Barnes's attention toward Naomi grew more persistent. He would ask her how her day was going, about her plans for the future, about her family. It felt as if he was probing her for information, subtly pushing boundaries in a way that made Naomi uneasy. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that he was just trying to be a good sheriff. By the end of July, Barnes had started offering Naomi rides home after her shifts at the diner. He would tell her that it wasn't safe for a young woman to walk alone in the dark. Naomi, though hesitant, accepted at first, mainly because she didn't want to cause trouble. Her walks home were long, and the thought of not having to walk in the heat or the dark was tempting. But every time she got in his car, Naomi felt more and more trapped. At first, their conversations were polite, talking about nothing in particular, but over time, Barnes began asking personal questions that made Naomi uncomfortable. He wanted to know about her hopes, her dreams, and most of all, her feelings of loneliness. It didn't take long for Barnes to cross the line. One evening, while driving her home, he placed his hand on Naomi's knee. His grip was firm, possessive. Naomi jerked away instinctively, but Barnes didn't seem to notice. He continued to talk as if nothing had happened, but Naomi's mind raced. This wasn't just the sheriff being friendly anymore. This was something darker. Her stomach twisted with anxiety. She tried to tell herself that she was overreacting, but deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. By early August, Barnes's behavior had become increasingly aggressive. He no longer just showed up at the diner or offered rides home. He began appearing at Naomi's house under the pretense of checking in on the neighborhood. Naomi's mother, Linda, didn't think much of it. She was too lost in her own world of alcohol and depression to notice the way Barnes's eyes lingered on Naomi, the way his smile stretched just a little too wide whenever he spoke to her. Naomi could feel the shift in Barnes's behavior. He no longer just watched her from a distance. He was coming closer, becoming more invasive. His visits were frequent, and his words grew darker with each passing day. He began asking Naomi if she felt safe walking around town, implying that something might happen to her if she didn't accept his help. Naomi was terrified. She tried to talk to her mother, but Linda was too drunk to understand. Her father had abandoned them long ago, and the town, steeped in its own racial prejudices, was not a place where a young black girl could seek help against a powerful white sheriff. Naomi had no one to turn to. As Barnes continued to invade her life, Naomi felt a sense of dread building inside her. She had no choice but to endure it. Her dreams of escaping Pine Hollow seemed further away than ever. As the summer heat sweltered in Pine Hollow, Naomi found herself drowning in fear. The sheriff's presence was a constant shadow, following her everywhere, never leaving her alone. The subtle threats grew stronger with each passing day. It was no longer about just keeping her safe or being friendly. It was about control. She felt it in the way he watched her when she walked down the street, the way his eyes seemed to follow her every move. Naomi was becoming a prisoner in her own life, and the small town that she once thought of as home now felt like a cage. Naomi could no longer deny it. Sheriff Barnes wanted something from her, something dark, something that no one would believe, and she feared it would only get worse. In mid-September, something changed in Naomi. She didn't know exactly when it happened, but one day she woke up and realized that she was missing her period. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than stress, the pressure of school and work taking its toll. But after a few more days, a sickening realization dawned on her. She was pregnant. Naomi couldn't breathe. She stared at the pregnancy test in her hand, the little blue line mocking her. The child growing inside her. She didn't know whether to feel love, hate, or pure terror. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She was pregnant with the sheriff's child. The thought made her stomach twist with disgust. How could she be in this situation? How had things gone this far? She couldn't help but think about the consequences. In a town like Pine Hollow, where everyone knew everyone's business, there was no escaping this. She knew that Sheriff Barnes would do anything to keep his secret hidden. He had already threatened her and manipulated her. He wouldn't hesitate to do something far worse if he knew she was carrying his child. For days, Naomi didn't know what to do. She couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe her? Her mother was too lost in her alcoholism to be of any help, and no one in Pine Hollow would take her side over the sheriff's. The town looked up to him, trusted him. What would they say if she spoke out? Naomi felt like a trapped animal, with nowhere to run and no one to turn to. But deep inside, Naomi was determined not to be a victim. She knew she couldn't stay silent forever. The truth was a weapon she had to wield, even if it meant putting her life at risk. Naomi started to document everything in a small, worn notebook. She wrote about the sheriff's visits, the things he said to her, the subtle threats, the fear she felt every day. She detailed everything, the way his touch lingered too long, the way his words made her skin crawl, the bruises she hid under her clothes. It was a way to fight back, even if it was only in the privacy of her own mind. Naomi began to keep track of the dates, the times, and the details of every encounter with Sheriff Barnes. She knew she had to be prepared, that someday she would have to face him and tell the world what had happened. But she wasn't ready yet. She needed more evidence. She began to collect physical evidence as well, scraps of torn clothing, photographs of bruises on her arms and legs, and even a broken bracelet she'd kept from a particularly violent outburst. Each piece was a reminder of what she had endured and a piece of her growing resolve to take him down. Naomi knew it wouldn't be easy. She was just a girl from a poor family with no real support. But in the quiet of her room, as she stared at the evidence she had gathered, she found a new strength. She was fighting for something bigger than herself now. She was fighting for her future, for the child growing inside her, and for the justice that had been denied to so many before her. As the days grew colder, Sheriff Barnes's actions grew more desperate. Naomi had no idea how much longer she could keep up the charade. The sheriff had started showing up unannounced at her house more often, and she could feel the tension building. She knew he suspected something was wrong, but he didn't yet know the full extent of her resistance. One evening, as Naomi was walking home from her job at the diner, she was startled to see Sheriff Barnes pull up beside her in his patrol car. He rolled down the window and gave her a knowing smile. "You're looking a little pale, Naomi," he said. His voice was smooth, but there was something cold in his tone. "You've been looking tired lately. Everything okay?" Naomi forced a smile, her heart racing in her chest. "I'm fine, Sheriff. Just been working a lot." "Working too much can wear a person down," he said, his gaze lingering on her longer than necessary. "But don't worry. I'm here for you. I can help." His words, once again, felt like a threat. Naomi wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. She was stuck. Every day felt like she was slowly suffocating. The weight of his gaze made her skin crawl. That night, she didn't sleep. She couldn't. The fear was overwhelming. Naomi knew the sheriff was becoming more dangerous, and that she needed to act fast. The evidence she had gathered was the key to her survival, but it wasn't enough. She needed a plan. The turning point came on October 15th. Naomi's worst fears were realized when she discovered that she was being watched. The deputy, who had once seemed like a friendly face, had casually mentioned her questions to the sheriff. Barnes must have known that Naomi was gathering evidence against him, and he wasn't about to let her get away with it. Naomi had just returned home from work on October 29th, 2010. The evening was cold, the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. She stepped into the house, feeling an eerie silence settle over the room. Her mother wasn't home, and the house seemed unusually empty. Naomi's senses went on high alert. She turned to close the door, and there he was, Sheriff James Barnes, standing in her living room. His dark silhouette was stark against the dim light of the single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Naomi froze, her breath catching in her throat. Barnes was calm, too calm. He knew everything. He knew about her plan. He knew about the evidence she had gathered, and he was ready to put an end to it. "You've been trying to ruin me, haven't you?" Barnes said, his voice eerily quiet. His eyes were dark with anger, but there was something else too. Something colder, more dangerous. Naomi didn't back down. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she held her ground. "I'm not going to let you get away with it," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Sheriff Barnes's eyes narrowed, his mouth curling into a sneer. "You think you can beat me? You think anyone will believe you?" Before Naomi could react, he lunged at her. The force of his attack sent her crashing against the wall. Everything happened in a blur, struggling, the sound of furniture crashing, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. Naomi fought back with every ounce of strength she had left. In the chaos, Naomi's hand brushed against something cold on the floor, a knife. Desperation surged through her, and without thinking, she grabbed it and turned it on Barnes. The blade sunk into his side. For a moment, there was silence. Then Barnes staggered back, his face twisted in shock and rage. Naomi's body trembled violently, but she didn't stop. She had to protect herself. She had to protect her future. The air in the room was thick with tension as Sheriff James Barnes staggered back, clutching his side where the knife had struck. His eyes were wide with shock, his breathing shallow as he tried to regain his footing. Naomi's hands were trembling, covered in the blood of a man who had terrorized her for so long. The fight, the struggle, it all seemed to happen in slow motion, but the finality of it hit her hard. She had done it. She had defended herself. For a moment, neither of them moved. Naomi stood there, her mind racing, her body flooded with adrenaline. She had never imagined that it would come to this. She never wanted to kill him. She only wanted to escape. But the sheriff had left her with no choice. His brutality had forced her hand. Naomi backed away, the knife still gripped tightly in her hand. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took in the sight of Barnes, collapsing to the floor. The man who had made her life a living nightmare was now on the ground, struggling for breath. Naomi's legs felt weak, and for a moment she wondered if this was really happening. Was this really the end of her torment? The sirens came suddenly, breaking the silence. The sound of the approaching police cars filled Naomi with a strange sense of dread. She knew what would happen when they arrived. The sheriff was well loved in Pine Hollow, and even though he had tried to destroy her life, she feared they would side with him. She had no one to trust, not really, not anymore. But then something shifted. Naomi realized that she couldn't run. She couldn't hide anymore. She had fought back. She had survived. And no matter what happened next, she had to face it. The truth had been buried under years of fear and silence, but now it was out in the open. As the police arrived at the scene, Naomi made no attempt to flee. She sat on the floor, blood on her hands, her face swollen from the earlier struggle. The officers entered, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. They saw Barnes, sprawled on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. They saw Naomi, broken but resolute, her hands raised in surrender. One of the officers moved cautiously toward her. "Naomi, what happened?" he asked. His voice was soft, careful, but Naomi could tell that he wasn't sure whether to believe her. She swallowed hard. The words stuck in her throat for a moment, but she finally found her voice. He tried to kill me. I had to defend myself." The officer nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The sheriff had been a beloved figure in Pine Hollow, and this wasn't going to be an easy story to tell. But Naomi's eyes locked onto his, and she saw something there, something that made her believe that he might listen. More officers arrived on the scene, and the atmosphere shifted. The room became charged with tension as they began to investigate. The details of the struggle were clear. Furniture overturned, blood splattered across the room, and the knife that had been used to defend herself. Naomi was covered in bruises, evidence of the assault she had endured for so long. A corner of Naomi's mind feared that the story would be twisted, that they would turn it around on her. But she refused to let that happen. She had fought for her life. She had done what was necessary, and she would make sure that the truth came out. As the investigation unfolded, Naomi's account of the events was carefully examined. The officers took statements, collected evidence, and began to piece together the story. Naomi's journal, her meticulous documentation of Sheriff Barnes's behavior, became a key piece of evidence. Every entry, every date, every detail of his threats and manipulations was there in black and white. The bruises on her arms, the torn clothing she had kept as evidence, and the photographs she had taken. Each item painted a picture of the abuse she had endured. It didn't take long for the truth to come to light. The town of Pine Hollow was shaken to its core as details of Sheriff Barnes's actions were revealed. He had used his position of power to control and manipulate young women, to terrorize them into silence. The whispers that had once seemed like nothing more than rumors were now undeniable facts. Sheriff Barnes had used his badge to hide the darkest parts of himself, and his grip on the town's trust was shattered. Naomi became a symbol of strength and survival, a young woman who had stood up to the very system that was meant to protect her. The town of Pine Hollow, which had once turned a blind eye to Barnes's behavior, was now forced to confront its own complicity. The mayor, the town council, and many of the sheriff's colleagues were horrified by what had been uncovered. But for Naomi, it wasn't enough. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for the other women who had suffered in silence for far too long. As the legal proceedings began, Naomi found herself at the center of a storm. She was no longer the scared girl who had walked the streets of Pine Hollow, afraid of her own shadow. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope for those who had suffered at the hands of powerful men. The trial of Sheriff James Barnes was a media frenzy. The once respected sheriff was now on trial for his crimes, and Naomi's testimony was at the heart of the case. She had to relive everything, the moments of fear, the moments of terror. But she did it. She stood on that witness stand and told her story, unflinching and unwavering. Her voice shook, but her words were clear and powerful. She spoke of the abuse, the threats, and the manipulation. She spoke of the fear she had lived with every day, knowing that the sheriff had the power to destroy her. But she also spoke of the strength it took to fight back, to survive. In the end, the jury found Sheriff Barnes guilty of all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, and the town of Pine Hollow was left to pick up the pieces of its shattered trust. For Naomi, the road to healing was long and difficult. There were days when she doubted herself, when the memories of what had happened threatened to overwhelm her, but she'd found support in unexpected places. The women of Pine Hollow, those who had once been silent, began to speak out. They shared their stories, their pain, and their hopes for a future free of abuse. Naomi's life was never the same, but she learned to live again. She went to college, pursued her dreams, and began to rebuild the life she had once feared was lost. The child she had carried in fear was now a source of love and joy, a constant reminder that she had fought not just for herself, but for the future she deserved. Years later, Naomi returned to Pine Hollow, not as the frightened girl who had been silenced by fear, but as a woman who had reclaimed her power. She stood at the front of a small community center, surrounded by survivors of abuse, sharing her story and inspiring others to speak out. The town of Pine Hollow had changed. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. The scars of the past remained, but they had been turned into a foundation for healing. Naomi had helped create that change, and in doing so, she had given a voice to the voiceless and hope to those who had none.